Welcome, dear friends, to the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where every cobblestone and thatched roof seems to hum with gentle secrets. Today, I invite you to settle into your coziest chair, perhaps with a steaming cup of tea, and join me for a tale of mystery and quiet intrigue, Death in the Church Vestry, a Miss Marple Mystery. Late afternoon sunlight bathes the village in a golden glow, and church bells echo softly across the lanes, where villagers carry baskets of flowers and small delights. Have you ever noticed the little details others overlook, hiding truths just beneath the surface? The village of St. Mary Mead was alive with a gentle hum of anticipation that Sunday morning, for it was the day of the annual harvest festival at the old parish church. Crisp sunlight streamed through the stained-glass windows, illuminating the polished pews and the scent of fresh flowers that mingled with the faint, earthy aroma of autumn leaves drifting through the open doors. Villagers chattered happily, exchanging recipes, gossip, and laughter, entirely unaware of the shadow that would soon fall over their familiar routines. It happened so suddenly that no one could quite comprehend it. In the vestry, just as the organist's fingers hovered over the keys, he collapsed, his eyes wide with an unspoken terror, and the music stopped abruptly. A stunned hush fell over the congregation. Whispers ricocheted through the nave as the constable hurriedly attempted to make sense of the scene. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the back, observed carefully. A window left slightly ajar, a strange perfume lingering in the air, and a hastily brushed handprint on the organ. These subtle clues pricked at her sharp mind. Who, she wondered, could harbor resentment deep enough to commit such a crime? Have you ever noticed something that didn't quite belong, yet everyone else seemed to ignore? Chapter 1. Whispers over Seed Cake. The little bell above the tea-room door jingled cheerfully as Miss Marple entered, though her keen eyes immediately registered the undercurrent of tension that had settled over the room. Normally, the chatter here was light, discussions of recipes, garden blooms, and the occasional knitting mishap, but today the air vibrated with a different energy. Each table was a microcosm of speculation, and the villagers' faces were drawn tight with concern, curiosity, or, in some cases, barely concealed suspicion. Mrs. Peters, the baker's wife, leaned forward eagerly over a cup of steaming tea, her hands wringing a lace handkerchief. "I tell you, Jane," she whispered, "I saw someone near the church early this morning. They moved quickly, and when I called out, they vanished as though into thin air. It was very strange indeed." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, making a mental note of the vague figure. At another table, the vicar sat in quiet dismay, clutching his hymn-book as if it might offer him guidance. "A tragic accident, surely," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The poor man was, after all, elderly. It is only natural that, well, fate intervenes in such gentle ways sometimes. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of doubt, one that did not escape Miss Marple's attention. Throughout the tea-room, conversations bounced between disbelief, conjecture, and half-remembered encounters. Some spoke of minor disputes over church finances. Others hinted at old grievances, long buried but never quite forgotten. As sugar dissolved in her tea, Miss Marple observed how even the gentlest villagers displayed subtle signs of unease, furtive glances, paused sentences, and whispered asides. The threads of the village's hidden stories were beginning to stir, like leaves caught in a soft autumn wind. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, taking careful note. In a village as small and seemingly tranquil as St. Mary Mead, every whispered secret, every hushed remark, could lead to an answer, or reveal yet another question. Miss Marple stepped lightly across the dew-speckled churchyard, her eyes taking in details that seemed invisible to everyone else. The morning sun glinted off the damp cobblestones, revealing footprints that had been partially washed away by the lingering mist. Some were crisp and deliberate, others hesitant, as if the wearer had paused mid-step, uncertain of their path. Most villagers, caught up in their own speculations and fears, did not even notice these subtle traces, but to Miss Marple they spoke volumes. Inside the vestry, the air still carried a faint tang of something unfamiliar, a scent both floral and sharp, a perfume perhaps, clinging to the polished wood and the organ keys. A peculiar stain marred the otherwise pristine carpet, dark and irregular, as though something had been hastily wiped away. The scene was neat, too neat, in fact. Panic, Miss Marple thought, often leaves its mark, yet here someone had been careful, too careful. Quietly she approached the churchwardens, two elderly men who fidgeted under her gentle gaze. "I wonder," she began softly, "did either of you notice anything out of place this morning? Perhaps something very small, easily overlooked." They shifted in their seats, clearing throats and offering polite denials, but Miss Marple detected hesitation, a slight avoidance of her gaze. She asked again, casually, phrasing her questions in the guise of concern rather than inquiry, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their nervousness began to reveal what they wished to hide. As she stepped back to observe the room from the corner, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together the fragments. Every smudge, every awkward glance, every half-truth told her something important. While the villagers murmured and speculated among themselves, she alone began to understand that beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's tranquil charm there were secrets carefully guarded, and that these secrets would not remain hidden for long. By mid-morning a gentle tension had settled over St. Mary Mead, subtle but pervasive, like a soft fog rolling across the fields. Even the youngest villagers, usually carefree as they chased each other through the churchyard or played hide-and-seek among the hedgerows, sensed that something was amiss. Their laughter was lighter, their games slower, punctuated by curious glances toward the church where the tragedy had occurred. Parents exchanged hurried explanations, hoping to soothe but failing to conceal their own apprehension. Miss Marple, seated on a weathered bench beneath the shade of an old oak, observed it all with calm attentiveness. She noted the small signs that others dismissed, the hesitation in a baker's greeting, the barely perceptible flinch of a child when a door creaked, the way villagers avoided discussing the vestry incident too openly. These were the markers of human unease, subtle signals that spoke louder than words. She reflected on the many times she had seen such behaviors throughout her life, how politeness often masks resentment, how quiet civility can conceal deep fears, and how the most seemingly ordinary people can harbor motives hidden even from themselves. St. Mary Mead, with its neat cottages and blooming gardens, appeared idyllic, yet, as she had learned long ago, every village holds stories untold, rivalries unspoken, and passions disguised beneath measured smiles. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, hushed murmur from a nearby villager. "I saw someone leaving the vestry in quite a hurry," the voice whispered, eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple's ears pricked, and a quiet smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Just as she suspected, the truth often lurked not in the grand gestures, but in fleeting glimpses, whispered comments, and the smallest of details overlooked by the unobservant. The game, she realized, was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Vicar's Concern. Miss Marple arrived at the church shortly after the morning service, the quiet crunch of her sensible shoes on the gravel path announcing her presence before she even stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and waxed pews, with a lingering aroma of the morning's flowers. She greeted the verger with a nod, noting the man's slightly furrowed brow and the nervous tapping of his fingers. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she said softly, as though easing into conversation rather than interrogating. "I was wondering if you might help me understand a few things about yesterday, or rather, this morning. Sometimes the smallest details escape others, but never the observant." Collins blinked, adjusting his cap, and offered her a hesitant smile. "Of course, Miss Marple. Anything to help. Though I can't say much, I fear. We're all quite unsettled." Miss Marple wandered through the vestry, gently examining the setting, and began speaking to the other staff, each conversation framed as idle curiosity. She asked about routines, unusual events, even minor disagreements, questions framed in the warmth of neighborly interest rather than suspicion. Gradually, the threads began to emerge. From a timid choir girl, she learned that the organist had had a sharp argument with the church treasurer the previous week over discrepancies in the accounts. The treasurer, it seemed, had discovered small sums unaccounted for, and the organist had defended himself vigorously, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. The girl's eyes flicked nervously toward the door as she spoke, hinting at unease she could not yet name. Miss Marple listened with calm attentiveness, nodding gently and asking small clarifying questions. Each answer was carefully catalogued in her mind: the timing of the argument, the nature of the dispute, the expressions and reactions of those involved. She sensed that while the quarrel might seem trivial to others, it could have created undercurrents strong enough to ripple through the village, hidden beneath the surface of polite conversation and stained-glass tranquility. Later that morning, a small commotion drew Miss Marple's attention to the church porch. A neat, square package had appeared on the doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a slightly frayed piece of twine. No card accompanied it, and no one seemed willing or able to claim it. The rector, a tall man with a perpetually worried expression, frowned as he picked it up. "I cannot imagine who would send this at such a time," he muttered, turning it over in his hands. Miss Marple approached quietly, her eyes taking in every detail. The paper was slightly worn at the edges, as though it had traveled some distance. The twine, loosely knotted, suggested haste or nervousness. She bent slightly, noting the handwriting scrawled across the top, neat, controlled, with a delicate curl to each letter, yet with a faint tremor, as if the writer had been anxious. It read only the organist's name. "Curious," she murmured, almost to herself. No mark of return, no sender, just the intended recipient. She allowed her gaze to sweep over the gathering staff and parishioners. Each face seemed careful not to betray too much, yet the tremor in one hand here, the slight flinch there, hinted that someone knew more than they were willing to admit. The rector gingerly placed the package on a nearby table, and Miss Marple made a mental note to return to it later. Small details such as these, simple, easily overlooked, and yet revealing in their subtleties, were often far more informative than any confession or shouted accusation. The way the twine had been tied, the slight smudge on one corner of the paper, even the angle at which it had been placed, all would help her reconstruct the journey of this mysterious gift. As she stepped back to observe, Miss Marple felt that quiet thrill of anticipation familiar to her, the sensation that, hidden in plain sight, a key piece of the puzzle was waiting to be noticed, and that those who delivered such things often revealed more than they intended. As the morning sun filtered through the tall church windows, Miss Marple settled into a quiet corner of the vestry, allowing herself a moment to reflect. She observed the faces around her, the neat, well-mannered villagers who, on any other day, would greet one another with warm smiles and polite chatter. Yet beneath those smiles, Miss Marple sensed the undercurrents of tension that only decades of careful observation could reveal. There were old rivalries, she noted, buried beneath years of cordiality. The baker's wife, so fond of recounting her perfect recipes, harbored subtle resentments toward the vicar's sister, whose garden always seemed to bloom more brilliantly. Envy had long simmered quietly in the hearts of others, the choir soprano jealous of the younger girl's voice, the treasurer wary of anyone who might challenge his authority. Even trivial disagreements over pew placement or flower arrangements could ignite sparks in a village so small, so tightly knit. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift over the polished wood of the organ, the faint scent of polished brass, and the meticulously arranged hymnals. Each object, each habit, each glance told its own story. Small towns, she reflected, are often like delicate tapestries. From a distance, they appear harmonious and orderly, yet up close, the threads reveal knots of tension, frayed edges of anger, and strands of quiet ambition. It was in these hidden spaces, Miss Marple knew, that motives took root, growing unseen until circumstance exposed them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stone floor. The constable entered, holding a small envelope carefully between gloved fingers. He announced its discovery as if it were the key to the entire mystery. Miss Marple glanced at it, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the timing, the neatness of the envelope, the way it was presented, it all felt rehearsed, too deliberate. Intuition prickling at her senses, she suspected that this piece of evidence, promising though it seemed, might yet lead the investigation astray rather than toward the truth. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Vestry. By mid-afternoon, the constable's decision had stirred a mixture of relief and whispered approval among the villagers. A nervous parishioner, Mr. Harold Finch, had been taken into custody. He was a man of middle age, with perpetually rumpled clothing and a habit of fidgeting with his hat, traits that now seemed to mark him as guilty in the eyes of those around him. Earlier that week, he had been overheard arguing with the organist about the placement of funds for the upcoming festival, an argument loud enough to catch the attention of several neighbors. In the tea-room and along the cobbled streets, conversations brimmed with satisfaction. "Well, at least the police have someone now," murmured Mrs. Peters, the baker's wife, as she dabbed at a tear-stained handkerchief. Others nodded, pleased that a resolution seemed at hand. Gossip spread like wildfire, stories growing taller and more colorful with each retelling. The villagers, eager for reassurance, found comfort in the simplicity of a single culprit. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly at her usual corner table, her cup of tea steaming gently before her. She did not feel the relief that seemed to wash over her neighbors. Instead, a quiet disquiet settled over her. Something in Mr. Finch's demeanor, the anxious twitch of his fingers, The way he avoided direct eye contact yet offered carefully measured explanations did not convince her of guilt. She remembered other instances in life where fear and circumstance could mimic the outward signs of culpability, and she suspected this was one of them. Her mind worked silently, tracing each interaction, each glimmer of inconsistency she had observed over the past days. While the villagers celebrated a seemingly neat resolution, Miss Marple recognized that appearances often deceived. The story, she knew, was rarely as simple as it seemed. The shadows in the vestry, she thought, were longer and more tangled than anyone suspected, and the real culprit remained unseen, still walking freely among them. Miss Marple found a quiet spot near the vestry doorway, her gaze unobtrusively sweeping over the faces of those gathered. Friends and family of Mr. Finch had arrived shortly after the arrest, their expressions carefully measured, some thinly veiling worry, others a touch of indignation. She observed the little tells, Mrs. Finch's hand pressed lightly against her chest, as if to steady a racing heartbeat. Young Timothy Finch, the nephew, fidgeting with his scarf, eyes darting toward the floor, yet never breaking the line of sight with his uncle, and Mr. Finch himself, trembling ever so slightly, but resolute in maintaining composure. The villagers murmured amongst themselves, casting glances that assumed guilt, but Miss Marple's attention lingered on subtleties. She noticed a slight hesitation in one neighbor's story, the way another's eyebrows lifted at a detail that seemed insignificant, and the tiny twitch of a lip that betrayed disbelief. Each gesture, each moment of tension, spoke to her trained eye more than words ever could. Turning her attention to the official timeline, Miss Marple mentally retraced the sequence as presented by the constable, the organist's arrival, the supposed dispute, the moments leading to the discovery of the body. Something felt off. The times did not align perfectly with the observations she had made in the tea-room and the churchyard. Certain footsteps had been heard earlier than the timeline suggested, and a particular window had been open at a moment when, according to the police, no one could have approached it. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts, and made mental notes of every discrepancy. The nervous reactions of friends and family, combined with inconsistencies in the authorities' story, painted a picture quite different from the neat resolution the villagers had embraced. Miss Marple leaned back, allowing a small, knowing smile to play at the corner of her lips. The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but she was certain that the truth would reveal itself to those patient enough to observe carefully rather than rush to judgment. By evening, St. Mary Mead seemed to hum with whispers, each conversation twisting and turning with its own version of events. In the cozy corners of the tea-room, villagers leaned across tables, voices dropping to conspiratorial tones as they recounted what they had seen, or thought they had seen, earlier that day. The story of Mr. Finch's argument with the organist became increasingly elaborate. Some claimed it had been heated enough to threaten blows, others insisted it was a polite disagreement, easily misunderstood. At the same time, conflicting accounts of the morning's happenings emerged. The postmistress insisted she had seen someone linger near the churchyard well before the organist's arrival, while the gardener was certain no one had passed the east gate until much later. Even minor details became fodder for debate: the tilt of the church door, the direction of scattered leaves, the pattern of sunlight on the vestry floor. Each version, although plausible, contradicted another. Miss Marple sat quietly at her usual bench near the window, sipping her tea and letting the chatter wash over her. Her mind sifted through each fragment, weighing gestures, glances, and hesitations against the tales that villagers told one another so eagerly. Appearances, she mused, were rarely what they seemed. A polite smile could conceal envy, a gentle nod could mask fear, and a whispered comment could hint at secrets better left undisturbed. Her attention shifted as a timid maid approached, her face pale and hands twisting a corner of her apron. In a hushed voice, barely above the hum of the tea-room, she whispered that she had seen someone leave the vestry in a great hurry, just moments before the body was discovered. The statement, fragile though it was, caught Miss Marple's sharp attention. It suggested an alternative possibility, one entirely unnoticed by the constable and the villagers eager for closure. The puzzle, she realized, was far from complete. While everyone else clung to the comforting certainty of a suspect already in custody, the true story of that fateful morning remained hidden, awaiting the careful eye of someone who knew how to observe without judgment. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Stained Glass. Miss Marple returned to the church the following morning, the sunlight streaming through the stained-glass windows casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the pews. The familiar scent of polished wood and lingering candle wax greeted her, but today it seemed tinged with an invisible tension, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the anxieties of the previous day. She moved quietly through the nave, her eyes observing, her ears attuned to the soft murmur of voices and the subtle creak of floorboards beneath the cautious footsteps of late arrivals. It did not take long for her keen perception to reveal threads of rivalry that had been hidden in plain sight. The organist, though well respected, had recently clashed with a visiting musician from a neighboring parish. The newcomer, a talented young man with a flair for dramatic interpretation, had questioned the older musician's methods and the allocation of funds for the church's music program. To any casual observer, such disagreements might seem trivial, mere differences of opinion over musical preferences. Yet Miss Marple knew better. In small villages, pride and principle often intertwine, and professional disputes can ripple into personal grudges. As she spoke discreetly with members of both families, subtler motives began to emerge. The organist's sister hinted at resentment toward the visiting musician's family, suggesting that their arrival had disrupted long-settled routines. Meanwhile, neighbors whispered about previous disagreements, minor slights that, accumulated over years, could ferment into deep-seated animosity. Miss Marple noted each comment, no matter how fleeting, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. It became clear that beneath the charming exterior of St. Mary Mead, old rivalries simmered quietly, concealed by polite greetings and measured conversation. Each slight, each glance, each whispered complaint carried the potential to ignite conflict, or worse, lead to tragedy. Miss Marple's mind, as always, catalogued these subtleties carefully, recognizing that in the delicate balance of village life, even the smallest spark could set events in motion that no one could have foreseen. Miss Marple's next visit took her to the treasurer's office, a small room tucked behind the vestry where stacks of ledgers and envelopes formed precarious towers on the worn oak desk. The air smelled faintly of ink and old paper, mingling with the subtle aroma of polished wood. The treasurer, a meticulously groomed man with pince-nez perched on his nose, greeted her with a courteous nod, though the tight line of his mouth suggested unease. "Miss Marple," he began cautiously, "I assure you everything is in order. The accounts are, well, orderly." Yet, as he spoke, his fingers nervously fiddled with a small pen, betraying more than words could. Miss Marple leaned in politely, observing, listening, allowing him to reveal more than he realized through simple human gestures. When she was invited to examine the ledgers, her sharp eyes immediately noted small discrepancies. Entries slightly out of sequence, a sum that appeared twice in 1 month, and several payments that lacked signatures or supporting notes. To an ordinary observer, these might seem insignificant, mere clerical errors. But Miss Marple, who had spent decades recognizing human patterns, saw potential motives hidden beneath the neat rows of numbers. A misplaced sum could indicate oversight, or a deliberate act, a mark of greed or miscalculation, one that might have inflamed tensions between the organist and the treasurer. She traced the transactions carefully, noting patterns that suggested the organist had grown increasingly concerned over the allocation of festival funds. Perhaps a small argument had escalated into something far more dangerous. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each subtle irregularity, linking them with the hushed conversations she had overheard in the vestry and the tea-room. Financial disputes, she reflected, often reveal far more than simple arithmetic. They expose priorities, resentments, and ambitions, the quiet sparks that can set ordinary people on extraordinary paths. In St. Mary Mead, even a modest sum of money could become the seed of tragedy, and Miss Marple intended to follow its trail with the patience and care only she could muster. By late afternoon, the church was quiet, the shadows of the stained-glass windows stretching across the polished pews like delicate fingers. Miss Marple sat near the back, her sharp eyes resting on a nervous parishioner who had been summoned for questioning. Mr. Linton, a timid man with perpetually trembling hands, avoided direct eye contact, shifting from foot to foot as if the floor itself might swallow him whole. It's nothing really," he stammered when Miss Marple addressed him, voice barely above a whisper. Yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. With gentle encouragement, she coaxed him into speaking, framing her questions as curiosity rather than accusation. Gradually, he confessed that the organist had been receiving notes, carefully folded and signed, each one bearing ominous words about watching and paying the price for certain actions. Fear had plagued him for weeks, he admitted, though he had confided in no one. Miss Marple listened intently, letting each detail sink in. The handwriting, the timing, the careful placement of the notes, each element hinted at premeditation. Her mind began to weave connections between the organist's recent disputes, the discrepancies in the treasurer's accounts, and now this growing menace. Patterns emerged that the constable, eager for a tidy resolution, had not yet discerned. "What do you think they meant?" Miss Marple asked softly, not seeking a direct answer, but observing Mr. Linton's reaction to gauge further truth. The parishioner's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and relief crossing his face, and he shook his head, murmuring, "I don't know, but it was frightening." As she reflected on this revelation, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, tracing the threads that connected envy, financial disputes, and personal grudges. The village, outwardly serene, hid tensions that were escalating, and she knew that the danger had not yet passed. Her intuition prickled. There would be another message, another sign, perhaps even a second act of intimidation in the vestry itself, signaling that the shadows over St. Mary Mead were far from dissipated. Chapter 5. The Hidden Hand. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden beams across the vestry, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the warm light. Miss Marple, moving with her characteristic quiet diligence, examined the room once more. Her fingers traced the polished edges of the organ, lingered over the brass candlesticks, and finally rested on a section of the vestry wall near the floorboards, an area she had never paid much attention to before. A faint irregularity in the woodwork caught her trained eye. With a careful push, a small panel shifted inward, revealing a narrow compartment long concealed. Inside lay a bundle of documents, tied neatly with faded ribbon. The papers were old, yet preserved, containing correspondence between the organist and members of the church committee, letters and notes hinting at irregularities in the accounts, disputed decisions over festival funds, and cryptic references to matters that had been best kept quiet. Miss Marple's sharp mind catalogued each item, noting not only the content but the careful arrangement of the papers. Someone had intended these documents to remain hidden, yet they had not been destroyed. The careful concealment suggested fear, perhaps a desire to protect reputations, or to cover actions that could cause scandal, or worse. Her gaze swept the room again, noting the slight layer of dust on the floorboards, the faint impressions where furniture had once rested, and the tiny scuff marks leading toward the vestry door. Each detail, she realized, offered clues to both the sequence of events and the intentions of those involved. This discovery changed everything. It was no longer merely a case of a sudden death. The evidence suggested a deliberate attempt to obscure truths, a subtle hand guiding circumstances to mislead. Miss Marple tucked the documents carefully into her bag, knowing that these hidden papers would help her connect the disparate threads of jealousy, financial disputes, and personal rivalries that had silently festered beneath St. Mary Mead's polite exterior. She stepped back, breathing in the quiet of the vestry, aware that this hidden compartment was only the first revelation. The village's secrets, she suspected, were far more tangled than anyone had yet imagined. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favorite chair that evening, the hidden documents resting carefully on the table before her. As she sipped her tea, her mind traced the delicate web of behaviors she had observed throughout the day. The more she considered the villagers' actions, the hesitant glances, the evasive replies, the carefully timed appearances, the more she recognized patterns she had seen before in other villages, other crises, and other seemingly trivial disputes that had spiraled into tragedy. She noted the small manipulations that humans employed so naturally, a whispered comment meant to sway opinion, a deliberate pause to suggest uncertainty, the strategic avoidance of certain topics. These were the tools of subtle betrayal, often invisible to the unobservant, yet unmistakable to a trained eye. In St. Mary Mead, such behaviors had appeared repeatedly, hidden beneath layers of polite conversation and smiles that betrayed nothing at first glance. Financial disputes, rivalries over status, minor slights long remembered, all of these had surfaced in the organist's life, culminating in a tension that no one had dared name aloud. Miss Marple compared each gesture and reaction to her experiences in other villages, where quiet envy had fueled arguments, and seemingly inconsequential acts had escalated into confrontation or mischief with dangerous consequences. Even the parishioners' collective eagerness to settle on Mr. Finch as the culprit struck her as part of this recurring pattern. Villagers often preferred a neat resolution, a simple target for suspicion, rather than confronting the more complex, uncomfortable truth. She could see the same impulse at work in the nervous glances, the subtle corrections to timelines, and the deliberate omissions in retellings of events. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each piece meticulously. The hidden documents, the threatening notes, the village's own dynamics, all formed a tapestry of influence, resentment, and misdirection. She understood, with quiet certainty, that these recurring human behaviors were the key to uncovering the truth. The patterns, she knew, would guide her to the source of the tension and, ultimately, to the person willing to manipulate the village's trust to achieve their own ends. The following morning, a letter arrived at the vicarage, carefully folded and sealed with plain wax. Miss Marple was present when it was handed over, noting the subtle tremor in the postman's hand and the slight hesitation before he spoke the recipient's name aloud. The envelope bore no return address, only the neatly inscribed name of the organist. With a delicate hand, the vicar broke the seal, and the folded paper revealed words that caused an immediate ripple of astonishment. The letter contained accusations, precise and deliberate, implicating someone previously regarded as entirely above suspicion, a pillar of the community, admired and respected, whose polite demeanor had shielded them from any hint of wrongdoing. The words were carefully chosen, suggesting knowledge of secrets few others could know, and the implications were impossible to ignore. Miss Marple studied the letter with her characteristic patience, noting the quality of the paper, the controlled handwriting, and the subtle pressure points where the writer had pressed harder with the pen. Each detail, she realized, carried meaning: the caution and care of the sender, the desire to remain anonymous, and the choice to disturb the comfortable certainty of the village with a carefully timed revelation. The parishioners gathered, exchanging startled glances. Murmurs swelled through the vestry as people struggled to reconcile the respected figure they knew with the accusations on the page. Even the constable, usually so confident in his methods, furrowed his brow and read the letter twice, clearly unsettled. Miss Marple's mind, however, remained composed. The anonymous note, while dramatic, fit neatly into the emerging puzzle. It highlighted motives, exposed vulnerabilities, and, crucially, hinted at a broader network of secrets and hidden resentments. As she pondered the implications, a sudden cough drew her attention. A secondary character, pale and shivering in the corner, had fallen ill unexpectedly. The timing seemed suspicious, too precise to be coincidence. The atmosphere of St. Mary Mead shifted subtly. The tension that had been building now felt electric, and Miss Marple knew the stakes had risen. Foul play was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming a pattern, one that demanded careful, patient observation. Chapter 6. The Masquerade of Manners. Miss Marple settled into the corner of the tea-room once more, her knitting quietly resting on her lap as she engaged in what appeared to be ordinary conversation. Yet beneath the soft tones and gentle smiles, her mind was alert, tracing each flicker of expression, each hesitation in speech. She had learned long ago that people reveal more than they intend, especially when asked the simplest questions in the gentlest of ways. Her approach was subtle. She spoke of the festival preparations, the weather, and the ordinary routines of the parish, all while weaving in inquiries that seemed casual but were, in truth, carefully calculated. "I wonder," she mused aloud, "if anyone noticed anything unusual about the organist's routine this past week? Perhaps a visitor, or a change in habits." The question was innocuous enough for the villagers to answer without alarm, but each response revealed a small truth or concealed anxiety. She observed Mrs. Peters, the baker's wife, as her hands fluttered nervously over a teacup, the steam reflecting fleetingly in her eyes. She watched the treasurer's jaw tighten when a passing comment hinted at financial matters. Even the timid parishioner, Mr. Linton, shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away though his voice remained polite and careful. Each reaction, Each minor inconsistency added a piece to Miss Marple's intricate mental map of the village's dynamics. Miss Marple's questions were never direct accusations. Rather, they were gentle invitations for the villagers to reveal themselves inadvertently. A simple inquiry about timing, a casual remark about a recent visit to the vestry, or a soft observation about the delivery of letters, all were carefully deployed to test honesty and consistency. By evening, she had gathered enough subtle indications to begin distinguishing between genuine innocence, feigned concern, and carefully concealed guilt. The psychological trap she had set was invisible, yet effective. The villagers answered as they pleased, yet Miss Marple's trained mind detected the cracks in their facades. She knew that patience and observation, rather than force or interrogation, would ultimately reveal the truth. The village fete arrived in St. Mary Mead with the usual air of cheerful anticipation. Brightly colored bunting fluttered between the lampposts. The scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the earthy aroma of hay bales, and the laughter of children rang over the fields. To the casual eye, the day seemed a simple celebration of community, yet Miss Marple's keen observation noted the undercurrents invisible to most. She wandered leisurely among the stalls, nodding politely to villagers and sampling a slice of seed cake here, a sip of lemonade there. Her attention, however, was on the interactions around her, the subtle shifts of posture, the fleeting exchanges of glances, the half-smiles that quickly disappeared behind polite laughter. She noticed Mr. Finch avoiding direct eye contact with the treasurer, and the visiting musician's fingers drumming impatiently against a wooden stall. Even the children, normally uninhibited, glanced nervously toward certain adults before resuming play. Miss Marple observed how conversations were carefully moderated, with villagers speaking in polite tones yet conveying hidden meanings through tone, hesitation, and timing. Small disagreements, so easily overlooked, appeared in the tilt of a head, the crossing of arms, the brief narrowing of eyes. Even in the apparent joy of the fete, old rivalries and resentments surfaced in subtle ways, confirming for Miss Marple that appearances could be dangerously deceptive. She paused near a flower stall, allowing a conversation between two elderly ladies to drift into her awareness. They spoke of the organist and his recent troubles, their voices soft but pointed, each comment loaded with implication. The subtle tension between families, the careful avoidance of certain topics, and the occasional nervous laughter all painted a picture of a village simultaneously festive and fraught with quiet anxiety. Miss Marple smiled faintly, sipping her tea. The fete, with its bustle and color, was the perfect lens through which to study human nature. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word revealed more than the eye could initially perceive, offering her insight into who might be hiding intentions beneath their carefully maintained civility. As the fete continued with laughter, music, and the scent of freshly baked pies, Miss Marple moved quietly among the crowds, her keen eyes noting every small detail. She observed who arrived when, who lingered near the vestry, and who seemed unusually attentive to the movements of others. Each fleeting glance and casual remark was stored carefully in her mind, building a mental timeline of the day's events. She retraced the comings and goings of key villagers, noting subtle inconsistencies. Mr. Finch had claimed to have been assisting with flower arrangements all morning, yet the position of certain bouquets suggested he had been elsewhere. The visiting musician's story of practicing in the church hall was contradicted by a neighbor's recollection of seeing him step outside briefly at an unexpected hour. Miss Marple catalogued these small anomalies, aware that minor deviations often conceal crucial truths. Beyond movement, she considered motives. Long-standing rivalries, financial tensions, and the organist's recent disputes all converged into a pattern of potential opportunity. Who stood to gain the most from his absence? Who had reason to manipulate perceptions, to shift suspicion onto another? Miss Marple weighed each factor with patience, recognizing that those who commit careful acts often leave only the smallest traces behind, readable only by someone trained to observe human nature. Her attention was suddenly caught by a hushed conversation near the refreshment tent. Two villagers spoke in whispers, glances darting around to ensure they were unseen. One voice, low and confident, suggested that the speaker believed no one suspected them of anything. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught every word, and her mind immediately began connecting this claim to the inconsistencies she had already noted. Here was someone emboldened, relying on the cover of the village's complacency, unaware that careful observation had already begun to unravel their carefully maintained facade. By the end of the afternoon, Miss Marple had constructed a timeline, identified contradictions, and mapped possible motives. Each detail, small yet significant, brought her one step closer to understanding not only what had occurred in the vestry, but also who believed they had successfully concealed their intentions. Chapter 7. Confessions in the Moonlight. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the village was bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the pale silver of the rising moon. Miss Marple chose this quiet hour deliberately, knowing that shadows and gentle light often encouraged honesty, and that people were more inclined to speak freely when the world seemed to pause around them. She invited the suspected parties to her cottage under the pretense of discussing festival arrangements, her tone warm, familiar, and entirely non-judgmental. Seated comfortably in her sitting room, Miss Marple began a gentle conversation about the village, its routines, and the preparations for the harvest festival. Questions were carefully woven into small talk: who had been visiting the church, whether anything seemed unusual in the vestry, and what each person thought of the recent tensions in town. On the surface, the dialogue appeared casual, but beneath her mild inquiries, Miss Marple was observing every twitch, every hesitation, every slight tightening of a jaw. She spoke softly of her own curiosity and fascination with human nature, recounting anecdotes from other villages, all carefully neutral and non-threatening. This allowed the visitors to feel comfortable and even eager to share their own recollections, unaware that their stories were being scrutinized for hidden inconsistencies. One by one, each suspect revealed details of their morning, their movements, and their interactions. Small contradictions emerged, often unintentional, a missed detail here, a vague recollection there. Miss Marple's serene smile never faltered, but her mind catalogued each inconsistency, connecting it to the evidence she had already gathered, the threatening notes, the hidden documents, the anonymous letter, and the subtle manipulations observed at the fete. By the end of the evening, Miss Marple had drawn out enough information to begin seeing the outlines of the truth. The suspects had spoken freely, offering pieces of their own stories without realizing that they were, in effect, revealing the gaps in their alibis and the motives that had driven their actions. In the quiet, moonlit room, the threads of deception were slowly unraveling, and the path to revelation had begun to take shape. Miss Marple's calm demeanor never wavered as she continued the conversation, her questions gentle, almost incidental, yet carefully designed to observe truth and deception alike. She asked about minor details, the timing of a morning walk, the delivery of letters, the appearance of the vestry, and allowed each suspect to respond without interruption. Her eyes, bright and unassuming, caught every twitch of a hand, every fleeting glance, every nervous swallow. It did not take long for contradictions to surface. One villager insisted they had been in the church hall the entire morning, yet another mentioned seeing them near the vestry gate. A supposed casual remark about the organist's recent concerns was contradicted by the tone and content of letters previously discovered. Miss Marple listened intently, cataloguing each discrepancy with the precision of a careful observer tracing the threads of a tapestry. Even more telling were the subtle signs of emotion, the trembling of lips, the avoidance of eye contact, the slight stiffening of posture when certain subjects were broached. Fear and guilt, she noted, were revealing in their own way, betraying intentions that polite speech attempted to conceal. A smile that failed to reach the eyes, a hesitant pause before answering, or an overeager correction of another's statement all painted a clearer picture than words alone could convey. As she pieced together these behaviors, Miss Marple began to see how grudges, envy, and petty rivalries had intertwined to form a network of subtle motives. Each suspect's story, when carefully compared with her observations, revealed inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. What had appeared at first glance as a neat sequence of events now showed its true complexity, a web of tension and hidden resentment, amplified by fear of exposure and the desire to protect one's reputation. By the time the night deepened and the moonlight slanted across the room, Miss Marple had drawn a vivid map of the village's undercurrents. Lies, she realized, were rarely absolute. They were revealed in nuance, gesture, and hesitation, and only the patient observer could untangle them into the coherent thread of truth. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her gaze calm and unassuming, as the threads of the evening's confessions began to weave themselves into a pattern she had anticipated yet allowed to emerge naturally. The nervous gestures, the hesitant recollections, and the inconsistencies in timing all pointed toward a motive far deeper than a simple quarrel or impulsive act. She allowed the room to settle into a comfortable quiet, giving the suspects time to relax, and in that space the truth began to show itself. It was envy, she realized, intertwined with a rivalry that stretched back years, an unspoken tension between families, one rooted in shared histories, old disagreements, and aspirations of superiority. The organist, well respected and admired for his dedication, had unintentionally become the keeper of a secret legacy, something that promised recognition and influence within the parish's musical traditions. One among them had seen this legacy as both a prize and a threat, a coveted honor that must not pass to another. Miss Marple's soft inquiries had allowed this fear to surface, revealing how carefully calculated actions could be misinterpreted as coincidence or chance. The perpetrator, driven by jealousy and a desire to protect, or claim, that legacy, had orchestrated the events in a way that almost misled the village, exploiting its natural politeness and tendency to avoid confrontation. Every minor manipulation, every hidden note, every silent glance now made sense when seen in the light of this underlying desire. The murderer's composure began to falter as the subtle tension in Miss Marple's voice and the patient observation in her eyes made them increasingly aware that their carefully crafted narrative had been unraveling. They shifted in their chair, a faint pallor creeping across their face, and Miss Marple noted it without comment, letting the realization settle quietly. The room held its breath, though no one yet understood the full extent of the revelation. The truth, long hidden beneath layers of civility and feigned ignorance, was now poised to surface fully. The stage was set. The real culprit had been caught off guard, unaware that the gentle, unassuming observer sitting before them had already traced the path of envy, rivalry, and secret ambition to its inevitable conclusion. Chapter 8. The Church Vestry Solved. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the stained-glass windows of St. Mary Mead's church, painting the pews in gentle hues of crimson, sapphire, and gold. Miss Marple stood at the front, her posture calm and dignified, as the villagers assembled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The air was thick with anticipation. Even the children, unusually subdued, sensed that something extraordinary was about to unfold. With her soft, deliberate voice, Miss Marple began to speak. She recounted the events leading to the organist's death, starting with the minor discrepancies that had first caught her attention: the slightly ajar window, the faint fragrance lingering in the vestry, and the hastily brushed handprint on the organ. Each detail was presented carefully, allowing the villagers to follow her reasoning without feeling accused. She explained the conflicting accounts she had observed at the fete, the inconsistencies in timelines, and the subtle behaviors that revealed hidden motives. "We must remember," she said gently, "that appearances often deceive. A polite smile can conceal fear, a courteous word can hide envy, and a simple act may mask a carefully planned intention." As she spoke, the villagers listened intently, eyes widening as Miss Marple connected the hidden documents, the threatening notes, and the anonymous letter to the interpersonal tensions that had quietly simmered beneath their polite facades. Slowly, she traced the web of rivalries, financial disputes, and personal grievances that had converged in the vestry that fateful morning. Finally, Miss Marple's gaze rested on the person whose subtle gestures had betrayed them from the very beginning. Step by step, she detailed how envy, long-standing rivalry, and a desire to protect, or claim, a secret legacy had driven the murderer's actions. She described how their careful manipulations had almost misled the village, yet the clues they overlooked, the footprints, the timing, the hesitant glances, had revealed the truth to her patient observation. By the time she finished, a hush had fallen over the congregation. Faces reflected a mix of shock, relief, and awe. Miss Marple's quiet reasoning had illuminated what had seemed an impenetrable mystery, and the villagers now understood that justice, tempered with understanding, had been quietly restored. As Miss Marple concluded her careful explanation, a tense silence filled the church. The accused, pale and trembling, finally found their voice. With a hesitant, quivering tone, they confessed, acknowledging the envy, rivalry, and fear that had driven them to commit the act. Every carefully constructed story, every attempt to deflect suspicion, unraveled in the face of Miss Marple's patient observation. The constable, standing discreetly at the back, nodded with quiet approval. He confirmed that Miss Marple's deductions aligned precisely with the evidence he had collected: footprints, letters, hidden documents, and timing. Though the villagers had initially been eager to accept the simplest resolution, it was now clear that justice had been served through meticulous reasoning, careful observation, and the subtle understanding of human nature that Miss Marple possessed in abundance. As the weight of revelation settled over St. Mary Mead, the villagers began to reflect on their own behaviors. They realized how readily they had embraced assumptions, allowed gossip to guide their judgments, and overlooked the quiet truths hidden in everyday gestures. Appearances, they learned, could be fragile, concealing both innocence and guilt behind polite smiles and courteous words. Even those who had believed themselves detached from the tragedy recognized the subtle ways envy, fear, and rivalry could shape human actions, often unnoticed until consequences arose. Miss Marple, seated calmly near the front pew, observed these reflections with a gentle, knowing smile. Her role had never been to accuse loudly or force confession, but to illuminate patterns, understand motives, and reveal truth with kindness and patience. The village, shaken yet enlightened, began to breathe more easily, the air of tension lifting gradually as the knowledge of resolution took hold. In that quiet moment, the church seemed restored, not just as a place of worship, but as a space where honesty, reflection, and careful observation reminded everyone that the smallest details often held the greatest significance. St. Mary Mead, for all its charm and civility, had been reminded that even the gentlest village harbored secrets, and that truth, when sought patiently, could always be found. The days following the resolution of the Vestry tragedy brought a gentle calm back to St. Mary Mead. Villagers resumed their routines with cautious relief, sweeping leaves from cobblestone streets, tending to gardens, and exchanging polite greetings that carried a slightly deeper warmth than before. The market square buzzed once more with friendly chatter, though now tinged with an unspoken awareness of the lessons the recent events had taught them. In the cozy sitting rooms and sunlit tea rooms, tea was poured with extra care, scones and seed cake shared among neighbors who now appreciated the comforting rituals of village life even more. Fireplaces crackled in hearths across the village, filling homes with the familiar sense of burning wood and comforting warmth. Children laughed again in the churchyard, though glances lingered for a moment on the now-repaired vestry, a quiet acknowledgment of the tension that had once gripped the community. Miss Marple, sitting in her own sitting-room with a steaming cup of tea in hand, observed it all with serene satisfaction. She noted the subtle gestures of cautious civility, the renewed attentiveness in conversation, and the polite consideration now extended even to those who had been involved in the turmoil. Yet she knew, as she always did, that human nature was rarely changed entirely by a single lesson. Curiosity, envy, and subtle rivalry would still quietly thread through the village's social fabric, and only careful observation could continue to reveal the truths hidden beneath ordinary life. Her eyes, warm but discerning, flicked to the window where church bells rang gently in the afternoon light. The villagers moved with a sense of relief, yet a slight pause in conversation here, a thoughtful glance there, reminded Miss Marple that the village had learned a lesson about trust, attention, and the importance of noticing the small details that often reveal the greatest truths. With a faint, knowing smile, she sipped her tea, quietly content. St. Mary Mead had returned to peace, yet she understood that beneath every polite smile and friendly gesture, human nature persisted, in all its complexity, waiting to be observed once more. As the sun dipped behind the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting a warm amber glow over the village, Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair by the fire. The gentle crackle of flames filled the cozy sitting-room, mingling with the faint chime of church bells in the distance. Outside, the village seemed to breathe quietly once more, its cobblestone lanes and flower-filled gardens restored to the familiar rhythm of everyday life. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp yet gentle, lingered on the flickering light as she reflected on the events that had unfolded. The organist's untimely death, the hidden letters, the subtle rivalries, and the intricate web of human motives, all had revealed the delicate balance between civility and secrecy in the village she knew so well. She considered how easily small gestures, overlooked glances, and fleeting words could conceal truths, and how patience and careful observation had brought clarity where others saw only confusion. Sipping her tea, she allowed herself a quiet smile, aware that human nature, in all its curiosity, envy, and kindness, remained both predictable and endlessly surprising. Even in the calmest of villages, she mused, there were mysteries to observe, lessons to learn, and truths hidden in plain sight. And to you, dear listener, she posed a gentle invitation. What small details might you notice in your own world that others could miss? Which gestures, whispered words, or fleeting expressions could reveal something deeper, waiting patiently for an observant eye to uncover? Miss Marple would be most delighted to hear your thoughts. As the fire crackled and the last rays of sunlight faded, she leaned back, content and watchful, knowing that even in quiet peace, the human heart remained a mystery worth observing.